Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending where you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us for Vera Institute of Justice's Research Speaker Series. We're going to get started in a few minutes, but before I wanted to give an overall welcome, talk about accessibility, and then we'll get along to our wonderful speaker who you can see here on your screen today, Dr. Nick Shapiro. So before anything else, want to highlight the accessibility that we have for today's event. So first of all, as you can see, there's an American Sign Language or ASL interpreter, and they're going to be spotlighted throughout the event today. If you have any trouble seeing the interpreter or the panelists, what you'll want to do is go to the View Options button at the very top of your screen. You're going to click View Options, and then you're going to click the View Side by Side from the menu. Also, we have live closed captioning today, and there are two ways to join depending on where you are. So if you're joining via Zoom, what you're going to do is click on the closed caption icon at the very bottom of your Zoom screen. Then you'll want to select the arrow next to the closed caption icon. And from the list of menu options, you're going to choose Show Subtitles, and then you'll be able to see the captions throughout the whole event at the very bottom of your screen. And if you're a Vera employee who's joining us from the office, you should have received an email from me last week if you RSVP'd, and then that email had a link to view the captions either on your phone or your laptop. But if you didn't get that email for some reason, feel free to send me a message on Slack and I will resend it to you. So that should be all with accessibility. If you have any questions about that, feel free to chat me directly. But otherwise, thank you all so much for coming again to the Research Speaker Series, which if you don't know, this is a way for you to hear from researchers who are advancing race equity through their scholarship, particularly in the criminal legal and immigration spaces. For those who follow this speaker series for a little bit, you might have noticed that since we are in the pandemic, we took some time to revive the series, and we've created a particular focus on inviting speakers who do really great research and also are really aligned with Vera's values and current aims of research. And so today we have a speaker who's amazing and is going to talk about mass incarceration and how it relates to environmental injustices. And it's really related to the work that our Vera California team does. And if you're interested in anything that Vera California does, I'll put a link to the team section of Vera's website in the chat in a little bit. And to briefly talk us through how we're going to do this event today, first, we're going to have a presentation from Dr. Shapiro. Then we'll have like a 10-minute or so break before we jump into the Q&A section, just so people can grab water or stretch or do whatever they need to do. And then the Q&A is going to be about 15 to 20 minutes. And if you have a question that you like to get answered and you're joining from Zoom, we just ask that you use the Q&A function at the very bottom of your screen. It will allow you to put in your question, we'll see it, and then we'll answer it. And if you're in the room, you could hopefully just send a message to Brandon on Slack, or you could walk up to him because Brandon is amazing and he's in office today. And Brandon is a researcher from the Vera California office, and he's going to be facilitating the Q&A portion in a little bit. So you'll send your questions to the Q&A chat or to Brandon. And what we want to do with the general chat on Zoom here is leave that as a space to say hi, hello, say what you're excited to learn, or share anything that you think is relevant. We just don't want any great questions to get lost in the chat because we may miss them. So I will stop talking soon, but I wanted to give a brief introduction to our speaker and then he'll kick things off. So Dr. Nicholas Shapiro is an assistant professor at the UCLA Institute for Society and Genetics. He is a multidisciplinary environmental researcher that studies and designs interventions into issues of chemical contamination and climate change. He has worked tracking the quasi-legal resale of 120,000 plus chemically contaminated housing units after Hurricane Katrina, developing air monitoring systems with communities impacted by unconventional natural gas extraction, and testing fossil fuel means of long-distance air travel. In 2019, he founded Carceral Ecologies, which is a lab where he works with approximately 20 students and staff to assess if environmental injustices are inextricable from mass incarceration. This is such an amazing topic, probably will always be timely, unfortunately. And I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Shapiro, who you can see his presentation's already up, and he'll walk us through the topic.
Well, thank you so much for this. It's wild to hear actual hands clapping in a room. It's overwhelming. I'm just used to the silent little emoji reactions. But thank you so much for this super exciting invitation. This really generous introduction, Jakiyah, and I hope this is the beginning of a longer set of conversations. And like a special thanks to Brandon and the California team for nominating me, and to Jakiyah for facilitating all of the logistics of this transcontinental and also hybrid talk. So that's a lot of moving pieces, and thanks everyone. Inspired by the amazing accessibility that y'all are providing, I also have a QR code on the screen, and if you'd like to sort of zoom in on figures or try and read text a little bit bigger, you can QR code the QR that's in front of you, and it'll download the slides, and it'll also download the speaker notes, which is very embarrassing. So enjoy those and see how actually robotic everything that I'm doing is. So give people a second. Looks like people captured it here. So, I hope that this is all work towards making this topic untimely, even though I think Jakiyah was exactly right in her introduction about the unfortunate timeliness of these issues. And I want to just start by saying that there are so many ways that issues of mass incarceration and environmental injustice, and specifically environmental racism, intersect. So many ways. And I just want to say that this is not a talk that will be exhaustive of all of those ways. It's not going to be a talk that goes through and charts the really incredible and rich history of community-led interventions that have raised these issues to the national and international scale. For that, I would direct you to David Pello's work, which is really incredible on this topic. And then also at the very end of this talk, you'll see another QR code, and that will lead you to a 50-page annotated bibliography, if exhaustiveness and overview is really what you're looking for. And so what I'll do today is sort of start by framing, give you a lay of the land, and then I'll touch on three of the many, many projects that our lab is trying to advance. The first project is sort of outside of the bounds of traditional environmental justice. It's about noise pollution, and it's about the noise pollution specifically stemming from helicopter surveillance in Los Angeles. And looking at how the way that the surveillance is disturbing the sleep, childhood development, educational attainment, and workplace performance of disproportionately surveilled Black and Latinx communities in LA County. And then in the second project, which is labeled number 3, I'm going to really all too briefly touch on work that we're attempting to do, looking at the entire carceral system in the US and trying to understand, as Jakiyah said, if and how environmental hazards are inextricable from the entire system of mass incarceration of carceral facilities, to try and avoid some of the reformist tendencies of environmental critique that I'll get into in a second. And then I'll end by discussing work on how carceral environments, particularly back in LA, how the LA County Jail is producing unnatural deaths, and then the county medical examiner coroner's office is failing to do due diligence on those deaths, and also has a bunch of structural conflicts of interest with the sheriff department that runs those jails, and as a result is using biomedicine to provide alibis for unaccountable share violence in the jail system. So the way that science, we have a complicated relationship with science, both sort of with it and against it in some ways. And so we're looking at how science is being used to naturalize unnatural Black and Latinx deaths in jail. And this is a pretty significant epistemological knock-on effects. Because if you're trying to do studies, say, looking at the official determinations of death, like cause of death and manner of death in jail or in custody in general, and you're trying to correlate those with environmental exposures, you're going to have really deep underestimates or misformed assumptions about what's going on because of the conflicts of interest and the relationship between the medical examiner's office and jailers. So it affects sort of like a baseline issue that we're trying to understand how to interrogate a bit better. Let's see. So our work advances along the fault line of these two potentially irreconcilable forms of critique and alternative world building. On the left, we have environmental research that is deeply invested in optimizing the systems, practices, and institutions that perpetuate environmental harms. Environmental regulatory policies in the US are basically dead set on finding the highest bearable level of pollution and ensuring that it prioritizes and protects industry's right to pollute and permission to pollute, rather than any sort of attempt to envision the abolition of those sources of pollution. So just inherently reformist. All of these critiques that we make in environmentalism writ large, like whether it be critiquing the environment or the internal combustion engine and ending up in the same system but with electric cars, or specifically in the case of prison and jail conditions and the environmental problems there. So that's what we have on the left, sort of a traditionally upholding white supremacy, often environmental science coming from European values of human-human and human-environmental relations. And on the right side of your screen, we have an incredibly well-theorized Black-led domain of accountability that refuses changeless change and reforms that shapeshift rather than eliminate harms. A domain that looks upstream to the problems that make mass incarceration persist and has already begun building alternative systems of public safety in the neighborhoods where the dangers of calling the police are most well understood. So it's in this friction between these two different schools of thought and practice that we do our work. And this is a friction that is encountered probably a lot of y'all do conditions work and know this all too well. You don't need me to say it. And so this is a friction that is larger than our work and comes from that difficult posture of trying to fight the indignity of carceral institutions while also recognizing that stopgap measures to address degrading conditions are often expanding the carceral capacity of the state, hiring more guards, increasing prisoner surveillance, and building more prisons, jails, and detention centers. So in that second project that I'll talk about, we are attempting to understand the hazards of the entire system as a whole in order to try and get away from that sort of whack-a-mole approach where you make a critique about a condition, it enhances carceral capacity, and the system actually gets stronger. And so we're kind of trying to experiment with an understanding. We're trying to see if systematic critique is maybe less or more immune rather to these kinds of co-optation than individual kinds of environmental critique of the conditions of carceral facilities. Or maybe we'll find out that it's actually more easily dismissible. But this is one of the things that we're trying to find out in this work, sort of on a conceptual level. What is looking at the whole picture, which has taken years and years and years. And as you'll see, I'm gonna move through it very quickly because it's not baked, we're not there. And it's a really difficult project, and it runs a little bit differently than our other projects. So, but before we get into it, let's meet the team. Here's the lab. You will see there in the back, one of your own. Brandon made it to the crawfish boil that we had as a little celebration for the end of the hard year. Southerner brought some Southern culture up to LA, and I think one of the key things that we try and do in the lab is mentor students from underrepresented backgrounds in science, specifically women of color And we recruit very heavily from the system impacted and formerly incarcerated students organization that's really well represented in the lab. So that sort of mentorship is actually in training is one of the key things that we do. Research is part of the key things that we do, but mentorship and training is key. We're at a university and we're training multidisciplinary researchers so they can work one day for amazing institutions like the Vera Institute. 3 of these recently graduated students have recently applied to the Vera, so keep a lookout for them. And so I'll start with this first project that I mentioned on the racialized noise pollution resulting from helicopter surveillance. And so this project began in 2020 when Kite on the far left and I were participating in this workshop with Lathan and Al. And neither Kite nor I could actually participate in this web conference because of the helicopters circling both of our houses in different parts of LA. And from there, we sort of banded together and got a small amount of money. And I hired Michelle Servin to start doing some of the preliminary visualizations. As you can see, this is my collaborators in the initial part of this work are artists and technologists. And then we're moving more into the data analysis component in the work that I do. So in this first grant, I ended up buying a bunch of the flight trajectories of all of the law enforcement helicopters in LA County. And I'll get into that in a second. But first, I want to just start by thinking a little bit about the history of helicopter surveillance in LA. It's not a coincidence that today the LAPD sort of advertises helicopter surveillance and SWAT in the same image. They arose together in the 1960s in order to quell Black rebellion, specifically the Watts Rebellion. And they're part of the militarization of the Los Angeles PD, and then increasingly the militarization of police forces across the country. And they also fed off of this sort of techno-optimism of Southern California, drawing a lot on sort of new technologies coming off of the Korean War, such as communication technologies amongst helicopters and high lumen spotlights. And so today, we now have predictive policing leading these helicopters on patrol in a way that is racially discriminatory and surveilling communities of color 22 hours a day. Thank you to the interpreters. Am I speaking too fast? How are we doing? Okay, doing okay, great. So yeah, I purchased the flight trajectories of an entire year of 51 law enforcement helicopters. And then we used some data made by Kelly Leiter Hernandez's $1 Million Hoods project. Oh, I'm sorry, part of it's getting a little cut off. Census data and also public housing data that I'll get into in just a second. So at first blush, at the sort of the 30,000 foot view, you might look at this hypersaturation of helicopter surveillance in LA and think that these patterns might not really be socially revealing because it's almost everywhere except for Malibu and some golf, and I think the Trump golf course over there actually. But as you zoom in a little bit, you can sort of start understanding the way that the distribution of people on the ground is patterning the way that they're being surveilled from the air. And you see each little dot is a ping to a location system that happens every few seconds and on a somewhat irregular basis. And these circles that you see are the orbits. So that often happens when the helicopter's circling a specific house or neighborhood or street. And those orbits can range from a few minutes, just a minute, a couple loops, to hours and hours and hours, as often happens sort of late in the middle of the night. And you can see sort of the stark differences between different neighborhoods. You can see where they do a lot of their transit as well as where they do most of their circling. And so you might not be surprised to find out that South Central, both the East and the West Side, are the places where the most hours are logged. I'm picking out the month of May as a representative month. And we see downtown Los Angeles as the third highest, and that's likely because that's where one of the helipads is for the helicopter. So it's we're skewing the information a little bit, and we're working on how to control for that. But the top two neighborhoods that are surveilled by these by these helicopters are sort of part of the Black core of Los Angeles County. And it's not just, these neighborhoods might not mean a lot to y'all. I don't know if you've spent time in LA, but going beyond these neighborhoods, we found that it is statistically significant that the Blacker the neighborhood, the more helicopter surveillance is happening. And we also found, literally just minutes ago, I was slacked this final computation, that also increasing the altitude decreases as the neighborhood gets more Black, Latinx, and Indigenous. And so they're flying more often in Black neighborhoods, and they're flying at lower altitudes in neighborhoods of color. And why that matters particularly is the disturbance of sleep. It matters for the disturbance of mental health generally during the day as well. The disturbance of Zoom work and school, but also particularly in the evenings. That's what we're really concerned about. And so who's doing this surveillance? It's primarily the LAPD, which is that top line. And then you might, maybe from New York, you might not think that the sheriff would have that many helicopters, but the sheriff is the second highest line. If the sheriff office in California or in LA has very lucrative contracts with a bunch of the cities within Los Angeles County that don't have their own police force. So the sheriff is doing policing in Los Angeles. So, and then you see all of the other cities inside of LA County that have their own helicopters also contributing to that overall cacophony of helicopter noise, of rotors sort of slapping the air thousands of times per second. And just to give you a little bit more of a taste of how racially concentrated these helicopter flights are, on the left you have neighborhoods that are, the whiteness here is actually related to racial makeup. So these whiter, there's two images here. On the left-hand side, it's sort of up by Malibu and the Palisades, and you can see the lack of red dots and lack of circling over there. And then we sort of zoom in on South Central, and we also highlight some of these housing projects in yellow. And those housing projects are where community-based policing is also happening. So this idea of the reform of community-based policing, sort of ridding traditional forms of surveillance, doesn't quite land. As you can see, there's a lot of circling over these yellow squares, which are these housing projects that are doing these pilot community-based policing projects. And that cluster down there, that's Watts right there, with those 4 housing projects in it. So as the background gets darker, also the proportion of Black, Latinx, and Indigenous population. And so this is ongoing work, and we just got a little grant to continue it, and we have an amazing set of advisors. Matthias Cadane from Stop LAPD Spying has been advising us on how to understand. He actually asked us to do the analysis on community-based policing, and we have an exciting set of PRAs, public records requests that we're going to be doing to understand the history of this kind of aerial surveillance even more. And Dr. Gina Poe, who's a sleep neuroscientist, who is really helping us track the cognitive and emotional impact of disturbed sleep, including how aerial surveillance contributes to the degradations in overall health, elevating diabetes and cancer risks, increased risk for auto accidents and workplace accidents, increased anxiety and mental health symptoms, and tens of other diseases and disorders with known associations with disturbed sleep. We are additionally working on mapping where the flights might impact childhood development, school grades, and school grades which have a lasting generational impact. Disturbing the already short sleep of adolescents can also result in decision-making impairment and increases in impulsivity and emotional liability at this sort of especially vulnerable age group. Sorry, I had to read there for a second. That is the neuroscientist speaking through me. And then Kate McInerney, who is the person who just was crunching the numbers and sending me the updated numbers, had a scholarship to do this work after Michelle Servin, who I mentioned earlier, graduated. And she's done a lot of the heavy lifting for this analysis and has applied for multiple jobs at Vera currently. And so I know I'm moving a little quickly, but so we're moving from this helicopter work to this work on distributed exposures, trying to understand the environmental hazards of the entire carceral system, so that some 7,000 carceral facilities across the country. And so this work is just really too sprawling to sort of lay out in a survey talk. It's just, there's a lot of variables, different states are doing different things, different counties are doing different things. There are so many different environmental regulations, and we are dealing with a huge amount of data. But basically, a group of over 15 students for at least a year and a half has been building a data set to try and understand how to access all of the EPA information about every single carceral facility. So it's really tedious, and the government doesn't supply this data, so we're making data sets. That's why the lab is so big, because the students are in there making these data sets to make new questions askable. So I'm not going to go into the findings, but I will talk about how we're breaking it up. CF here means carceral facilities. So we're looking at carceral facilities as source of exposure, how they themselves are unaccountable systems causing mass endangerment, by looking at both surveys when I go into a carceral facility, and also looking at the enforcement data for environmental regulations. So the water photo in the sink is one of our currently incarcerated members taking a photo of the water that he drinks in Georgia. The bottom left is a thermal image I took of water seeping through the wall and causing mold to grow in a prison in Mississippi. And those are also inspection photos of prison in Mississippi above it. So the prison, the jail, the detention center, the supposed keystone in the system of criminal punishment being utterly unaccountable is sort of what we're looking at there. They're really not, these facilities aren't being inspected. And when they do find violations, there's not really much of a enforcement mechanism other than stiffly worded letters. So for the Safe Drinking Water Act, of thousands of violations, I think there's only 60 over 10 years, 60 formal enforcement attempts. So everything else was just letters that were written. And then the other aspect of this is in trying to understand the environmental injustices of mass incarceration is understanding where carceral facilities are sited related in proximity to existing exposure sources, because these are residential facilities that can be zoned as industrial and put right next to factories. So sometimes I get called in by communities to come figure out what is polluting the community writ large, and I'll go into a community and I'll see the prison, the jail, and the detention center much closer to the exposure source than where people in the free population are living. And then also doing a bunch of work on extreme climates and climate change. Supporting some work you might have seen at the Intercept that did work on floods, fire, and extreme temperature risk in carceral facilities across the nation. They did that work, but we just did some data support. And then also doing some work with some Indigenous investigative reporters on Bureau of Indian Affairs jails and their climate risks. So I'm not gonna really get into this work, as I said, it's too sprawling, but I will just take a moment to pause and reflect on the different forms of collaboration that we take across our different projects. In the helicopter project, we have a stepped engagement, which is sort of, we have paid advisors. We pay $250 an hour for community members to advise us. And when we have a little bit of money, and then as we get bigger grants, then we pull them on as co-investigators and do subcontracts and have more financial exchange, one-way movement. And then in this project that we're sort of too big to have any one community partner or set of community partners, we just do sort of distributed listening, or word gets out that we're doing this kind of work, and everyone just writes us letters. And so we just try and keep up with the letters to figure out what are the variables that we need to be testing for and thinking about. And then in this final project I'll talk about in just a second, it's community initiated work, where the community members conceived of the study, they got the data, and they were just like, do it. And so there's, we don't have a one size fits all form of collaboration. So sorry, that's moving kind of fast, but yeah, this work is taking a very, very long time. So I'm just this is the last of the projects that I'll share with you today. And it is, as I mentioned, taking a national issue, which is this unaccountability of death that happens in carceral facilities, and citing it in a specific place in LA County. So the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is funding this work that was really initiated by Helen Jones, whose son died in LA County Jail in 2009. It was initially deemed a suicide. And then the sheer amount of blunt force trauma to his body led the coroner medical examiner to revise their determination of death from suicide to undetermined. And this is very rarely happens that there's this kind of backpedaling in these official determinations of death. But since then, Helen has been trying to organize around this. She now works, organizes with Dignity and Power Now in LA, co-founded by Patrisse Cullors. And she, along with her collaborator, Michelle Infante at Dignity and Power Now, requested all of the deaths that happened between 2009 and 2018 in LA County jails, which is 260 deaths. And the medical examiner's office only gave her 58 cases. So there's a huge amount of requests, very few actual autopsies that we received, and that's partially due to security holds where the sheriff department disallows the public disclosure of of death investigation records, and partially due to what we think is improper record management at the medical examiner's office. So we can't decipher why we're not getting that information, but it's a small window. And these deaths are happening in LA County Jail that has been experiencing this crisis of carceral death that preceded the beginning of the pandemic by several years. And so this is a visual overview of what we're finding, what we're looking at. First, you have pretrial detention, and 3 out of 4 deaths that occur in LA County Jail and in LA County jails is pretrial. And so those boxes are proportional to how many deaths were happening. And this is where I think particularly where my lab is learning a lot from Vera, California, and their work on pretrial detention, on cash bail, on closing this really infamous jail called Men's Central Jail that even the existing sheriff, I won't get into, calls a dungeon. And they're also advancing some really incredible work around alternatives to incarceration. And so you can see if 3 out of 4 of these deaths are happening pre-trial, the way that racialized cash bail processes are happening, that they are actually producing death. And the real fundamental life-saving capacity of some of the alternatives that are being advanced by Vera, California. And I think it's an interesting conversation to have across the jail conditions work and the alternatives to incarceration work. And I'm really lucky to be starting that conversation. And what we see inside the jail is mental health, healthcare, and deputy violence as driving these deaths. The largest correlate of death is actual or alleged mental health care or mental health issues. And so that's one of the key places where we can see diversion programs saving lives. And I say documented or alleged because oftentimes the sheriff deputies allege that there's a mental health issue as an alibi for death to explain why certain kinds of uses of force were necessary, even if there's no medically documented mental health issues. So it's a really complex thing. It's both people with mental health issues are being killed, and also people that die their deaths are being explained away by mental health issues that have not been medically diagnosed. So we see this cutting along racial lines. If you see on the left, this is the data of every single death that occurred between 2009 and 2018. And you can see the large amount of Black deaths that are deemed natural. On the left side, they use different categories in both of these documents. On the left side, illness is where natural deaths fall. You'll see it's disproportionately, vastly disproportionately Black. Black people make up 8% of LA County, and the vast majority of natural deaths. Vast plurality of natural deaths. And then in the autopsies that we were given, which is the graph on the right, you'll see also that disproportionate naturalization of Black death. And the Black population is not older or sicker than the other populations, which might be used to explain away this racialized distribution of death. And I think another important thing to look at is not just which deaths are being deemed as natural, but which deaths are being deemed as undetermined. And these undetermined deaths, we do see statistically significantly lower ages. So this is where a lot of the youngest people are dying, and where the medical examiner is failing to push a determination of death onto that death. And so it's predominantly, that's where Latinx deaths are, young deaths are happening, and the medical examiner is not deeming them to have a manner of death. And so I'm almost done. And how does this happen? How does this happen? So what I think is really important to know is that there are national standards for medical examiners and coroners that are not being followed. These national standards say that the medical examiner should look at all of the medical records, and it should be both the person who attends to the field site, to the actual place of death, who visits the site, and also the person that performs the autopsy. And in 0% of all of the autopsies that we reviewed, did all of the people that needed to look at the medical documents look at all of the appropriate medical documents. It's a long way of saying that, but there are two different people that need to look at least two different documents: the medical records in the jail and the EMS documents. And in none of the cases did both of those people look at both of those documents. And so if you don't have the medical records on hand, then you're going to be often relying on sheriff and detective accounts. And that's where bias is injected into this process, where the people that would be responsible for the deaths are narrating their mental health and their physical health, and relaying that often verbally. And you also have law enforcement present during autopsies in the vast majority of cases. And you also have the people that would be held liable for medical negligence sitting in on 1 in 4 of the autopsies. And this is happening in a long line of attempts by law enforcement in LA to naturalize Black death. This is a case in the 80s where the chief of police in the LAPD said, we may be finding that in some Blacks, when the hold, as in the choke hold, is applied, the veins or arteries do not open up as fast as they do on, quote, normal people. So this is a long line of attempts to naturalize law enforcement related Black deaths in Los Angeles County. There are some conclusions about the necessity for changes in the conflicts of interest in the medical examiner's office for us to really be able to value and find empirical insights from official death and custody determinations. And we also, in the helicopter work, we're seeing the deep hypocrisies of the way that policing, which is supposed to provide safety, is also providing racialized harms. And so we're adding to this sort of long course of this large course of research looking at the harms of policing even before incarceration, and then eventual death. So that's a lot, and I started sped up a little bit because we were running a little low on time. I think we started a little bit late, but that's a little bit of an overview of the things that we're doing. I am excited to hear more about what everyone here is doing, and excited for the conversation that's going to ensue after a little break. So thank you, everyone.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. So we are going to take a 10-minute break or so. So I see it's 3:45 p.m. Eastern time right now. So we'll break until 3:55 p.m. Eastern. And I think on the Vera calendar, it may say that this event goes until 4, but it's actually 4:15, so we'll still have a decent amount of time for Q&A. So yeah, feel free to get water, do whatever you need to do during the break, and we'll reconvene at 3:55 p.m. So don't leave, we'll be back. 1 second.
Yeah.
All right, everyone, it is 3:55, and we will resume with the Q&A. And we have Brandon here, who I will now spotlight. As I mentioned, Brandon is from our Vera, California office and is a researcher and will facilitate the Q&A portion of this event. So as a reminder, if you have any questions for Dr. Shapiro and you're on Zoom, you can put it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to everything, but I'm sure Brandon probably got a lot of great questions from people in the office. So we'll go again until 4:15 Eastern and try to get through everything. So I'll pass it off to Brandon and Dr. Shapiro.
Thank you so much for that. Let's see how we can work. How about that? Is that better? No, still. All right, we're gonna figure this out. Clearly, I don't work out of this office. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for attending our talk, and thank you again for Dr. Shapiro for helping out. My name is Brandon. I'm a research analyst for the Vera, California office. We have a couple of questions, and I guess we'll just kind of go back and forth. I guess a first question that we had, which is kind of understanding who is responsible for enforcing those kind of toxicity violations that you kind of talked about. And in particular, what is the kind of follow-up? You spoke about 60 violations being kind of like followed up, and someone was wondering what that actually looks like for prisons across the US.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'm sorry for having to expedite that middle part of the talk. I really just wanted to not take up too much of your time. I know it's the afternoon here, so it's a great question. So the kinds of enforcement measures vary by which regulation is being enforced. But I was talking about the Safe Drinking Water Act. And many carceral facilities are drinking from municipal water, so water that's not specifically for that carceral facility. But then there are several hundred that are large enough that they have their own water treatment plant. And so those are the ones that we're specifically looking at, where the drinking water that's cleaned by that water treatment facility is only drunk by people that are incarcerated, potentially by COs, but usually in these instances where there's water pollution, all the COs bring their own water. So what can happen? What can happen is fines largely, and the amount of fines is ironic because it just eats up budget of the water treatment plant, and so you can kind of see the way that punitive logics work always in the ways that these fines are reducing the capacity for these carceral facilities to clean their water. So that's largely what happens. I guess eventually they could get their permit revoked and they'd have to find a different water source, but I've never seen that happen. Yeah, but it is a great question. And I think one other thing that I wanted to note about that work is that this work is really, really hard to publish because the reviewers for environmental science journals don't understand why incarcerated populations deserve their own analysis. And they don't understand why people that have no other form of water source deserve to be studied on their own. So our papers keep getting rejected, and that's why you're hearing this unpublished work, because reviewers from ostensibly anti-racist environmental science journals are saying that we need a control, and there is no control to this population that we can think of. Maybe y'all can. And there's a unique inability to mitigate these exposures in carceral environments, and that's not really being recognized by the scientific community when we try and get this work published. So just wanted to say, in addition to the violation problem, it's really hard to even get this work into the scientific journals.
Awesome, thank you so much. We're gonna move on to our next question, which is someone was curious about if you could extrapolate a little bit about the stepped engagement that you mentioned, particularly that your lab works with community members, and how did you determine how much to pay them? Particularly paying them fairly is something that we're really trying to think about working with folks in a non-extractive way.
Yeah. And I definitely don't have all of the answers, but I can talk about what we do. In terms of the stepped engagement, we try and take up as little time as possible when we're first starting a project and we're involving community members. We want to make sure that they're not engaged in like really elaborate contractor forms. I work at a public university, so in order to get any money, you kind of have to fill out like 12 forms. And so that's been a whole bureaucratic process, honestly. Maybe it's a little easier here, I'm not sure. No, okay, I'm sorry. So that, I think it's something, yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to. Everyone said that, it wasn't just one person. I think it's something to think about as an organization about how you can move money without putting a burden on the moving of that money. Oftentimes, I'll have a community advisor in a project, and the university will ask me to make them fill out several hours of paperwork for a single hour of consultation. And so if that were to happen, then I would probably pay them for the several hours in addition to the 1 hour. But sometimes you just have to, maybe I shouldn't say this online. Sometimes you have to like just pay out of pocket. Like I'll just take the hit and just like do that. I would not recommend that institutionally. Please, like a more nimble institution should do something better. And we pay right now across the board $250 an hour for contract work. And then it gets more complicated with like the work that we're doing with Terrence Keel. I don't think I probably actually introduced Terrence Keel. The other collaborator on the deaths in custody work is across my department in the life sciences and African American studies. And he's doing parallel work on deaths on the street in the medical examiners. And so that's part of where the collaboration comes from. But just to be clear about the finances, and Robert Wood Johnson Foundation does a great job at this. And so all three of us get paid the same amount of money, even though Dr. Keel is much more senior than I am. He's about to be a full professor, and I'm just a rink-a-dink assistant professor. And Helen Jones, the community partner. We all get paid the same amount of money, which I think I'm very impressed with how Robert Wood Johnson is handling their funding. And we're trying to organize on campus about the difficulties and the bureaucratic violence that happens with attempting to move money to communities. It's really easy to move. It's not easy, but if you're moving a ton of money, then the amount of time versus the amount of time you spend per dollar moved is much better. But there's a whole mid-range where if you're trying to move a middle amount of money, it's really difficult and requires a lot of paperwork. And I see in other community engagement moments where that bureaucratic process sometimes gets weaponized to control power. For the academic uses it to sort of push out community partners, and I get brought into immediate conflicts like that. So that's our policy, and maybe we need to, with inflation on the rise, revisit our $250 an hour. But the hope is that we'll compensate for time and then also put money into other initiatives within the organization. And we're also doing oral histories, and we're compensating families $250 per hour for oral histories to help us nuance what we're seeing in the data.
Awesome, thank you. We have an attendant who is really interested in trying to understand what is the impacts of environmental racism or environmental pollution on children and how that's related to the prison. Someone was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Is this one?
Yeah, just a summary.
Okay. Yeah, and so I think I would just say this is a little bit out of my expertise. I'm not a pediatric specialist, but the first years of life are important and can track across the lifespan. And so that's where we're really gaining a lot of insights from Professor Gina Poe, who's the sleep neuroscientist that has some specialty in pediatric impacts. And so you remember that's the point of the presentation where I was like strictly reading from the slide. So it's a little bit out of scope. But I do think that it is something that we're deeply concerned about, is understanding the way that disturbed sleep sticks with you after you even leave that neighborhood. And what's happening now is that Kate, who you saw on screen and who's slacking me the latest data a second ago, she's going out to the helicopter heliports, and we're recording the decibels of the different helicopters at different altitudes. And so we'll be able to more finely understand the decibel exposure of any given population based upon the flight trajectories and our understanding of distance's relationship to decibels. And we can also modulate open windows versus closed windows. And so that's how we're going to get a really detailed analysis of these impacts on different parts of the lifespan, including pediatrics.
Yeah, amazing. And I think that actually segues really well to the next question, which is, what are some of the next steps for some of these projects? And in particular, what can researchers in other states do to kind of build upon some of this work and, maybe take some of this on from, outside of an LA or California context?
It's such a great question. And I think I'll start with the worst answer, the worst part of my answer, which is the helicopter work probably won't translate too well to other municipalities, maybe Houston, but because of the very unique history of helicopter surveillance, LA happens to be this capital of helicopter surveillance, and the sprawl is part of that as well. So maybe my hometown of Atlanta, I don't remember the helicopters really being a big issue there. So that's a project that might not scale and might not go elsewhere very well. But in terms of the other projects, I think this is just sort of the exciting part about talking with a national organization, especially one that is based in all of the 3 places where I've lived in the US. Lived in New York for a while, from Georgia, but I lived in New Orleans for a long time and now live in LA. So these are places that I am really interested in. So I'm excited to start up a national conversation. The deaths in custody work is really being led out of New Orleans. This woman named Andrea Armstrong, who's a lawyer at Loyola, is doing just really incredible work looking at how the accounting for deaths in custody is being moved within the DOJ from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, like the data nerds, to the Bureau of Justice Affairs, I think, which is like the people who do the implementation of the JAG funding. So in that process, in that movement, basically these data sets are collapsing and not really coming to play. So that's being led out of New Orleans. And she's leading a national group that's really exciting. Happy to introduce anyone that might be interested in being part of that group. And the deaths in custody work that's looking at medical examiners' complicity is something that we would love to share. I come from like open source software communities. So basically all of our methods are already online on this place called GitHub. I'm happy to direct you to it. So we would love replication. We'd love to be in conversation. I think I've already learned a lot from just looking at this dashboard about jail closure that Vera, California has made. Specifically, I only look at the death data, and I haven't been looking at the overall rates of incarceration by race over time, which made the disproportionate Black death in custody even more stark. I actually didn't know that there was almost double the Latinx population as a Black population in jail. So this increased Black death rate is even more concerning. That it's happening by disproportionate surveillance and arrests outside of the jail, but also being furthered inside of the jail context. So these are things that I'd love to stay in conversation about. And I think I have a lot of trepidation also presenting to this audience, because I've come to criminal justice and carceral issues in the last like 3 or 4 years. and y'all have been doing it for a lifetime. And so I'm sure that there are like lots of bit tongues or, things that you can help me learn about. So I'd love to keep learning from y'all.
Awesome, thank you. And I think we have time for maybe one more question. And this last question kind of comes from someone who is trying to understand, if it was hoping to understand a little bit more about how prisons kind of pollute or impact the environmental well-being of the communities where they're in, and if that's something that you've taken a look at. And if so, if you could talk a little bit about what that kind of looks like, and kind of what are the issues there?
Yeah, it's a great question, and unfortunately, that my answer is a little underwhelming. That we're still trying to figure it out. The Safe Drinking Water Act is really where we started looking at in terms of the environmental regulations of prisons, jails, and detention centers. Excuse me. But what's next is the Clean Water Act, and that's the disposal of feces or sewage. And we see many, many, many more violations happening in the Clean Water Act than we see in the Safe Drinking Water Act. Partially how that they're regulated and monitored, but we're seeing more pollution of bodies of water next to carceral facilities than we're seeing pollution of the water itself. And I'm not saying that the drinking water isn't polluted, but we just see more violations. And so that's the problem. Are we seeing the regulatory apparatus, or are we seeing reality? And that's sort of what we're trying to parse here. And so, I'm not sure how much I can speak to it, but in some work we were doing in Mississippi, some of our partners were talking with the local neighbors about the sewage that's being put into the stream, and they're in violation for multiple years. We're seeing that in a lot of these carceral facilities, years and years and years of sewage going into the stream. And because of that balance between employment and environmental contamination was hard, a lot of people weren't really willing to speak up about that contamination, but other kinds of contamination that people are maybe potentially more willing to speak up about is air pollution from like boilers that happen for hot water generation, sometimes power generation, and also potentially some of these occupational exposures. And so we're really interested in looking at, I'm not sure who to make eye contact with. Sorry, I'll look at the camera a little bit more. We're also looking at OSHA data, so the occupational data, because indoor environments are more regulated for workplaces than they are for residences. So a CO may have less exposure to a toxicant than an incarcerated person, but their bodies are more protected. And so we're trying to figure out how that can be leveraged. We're skeptical about the unexpected solidarity that may arise from occupational exposures, but we got to try, I guess. Yeah, so that's sort of the lay of the land a little bit.
I think that's all we have time for today. I mean, unless you want to take a very quick stab at a question that someone sent in, which is, if you've noticed any difference between racial and gender lines, like if there's a difference in mortality behind bars between, say, Black men versus Black women, and if so, what is there can be kind of done to highlight that?
It's a great question. I want to also go back one step and to talk about the pollution of other communities, and then answer this one because it stirred something in my mind. One of the analyses we did, we found that there was the most statistically significant variable to predict when there was a Safe Drinking Water Act was when the percent minority of the surrounding neighborhood was higher of the carceral facility. So there's a way that we can see potentially, we don't know, we don't have the mechanism, but the way that we can see environmental racism happening in the divestment and communities of color impacting people that are incarcerated in those neighborhoods, if that makes any sense. Anyway, but to speak about gender and the deaths, we see very few, it's almost exclusively men that we have the autopsies of. I think there were just a handful of deaths, primarily Black women. There were no white women in our data set related to in custody deaths and autopsies that we had. And it's very hard for us to make any extrapolations because of the small number of female deaths that we had. But there, many of them stick out in terms of being profoundly disturbing, including a blunt force trauma incident where the woman was released while in a coma and then died, technically not in custody. So she's not part of the data that was reported to the Department of Justice because she was released after her injury. And I'm really sorry that that is going to be the last image that we leave you with. I can see the horror on the face of one of the ASL interpreters. But I know this is a deeply traumatic topic and probably even more uncomfortably coming out of my mouth. So I appreciate all of you for enduring it and your great questions. And I'm very lucky to be in conversation with you all.
Yes, amazing. Thank you. Dr. Shapiro, this is amazing. You're probably going to see a lot of thank yous come through in the chat, but really can't understate how amazing it was to make the connection between environment and mass incarceration and just incarceration in general. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, and thank you to everyone who attended. We will send a recording of this event in addition to the transcript and some information that I know Dr. Shapiro put in the chat earlier, the annotated bibliography. We'll send that out later to everyone who attended. And our next event will be sometime in August, and we'll circulate information via email and on Vera's website about that once we have more details. But again, yeah, thank you, Dr. Shapiro, and thank you, Brandon. Thank you, our interpreters. Thank you, our captioners. Thank you, IT and workplace services, everyone who made this event a success. So thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. And big thanks to the interpreters as well.